Hello, Dr. Darty here with a few words, not too many I hope, on Chapter 9, the gastrointestinal system. Oh, it's a thick chapter. It has lots of words in it. To be absolutely honest, the digestive system was never my A&P students' favorite topic. I tried really hard, tried a lot of different activities and different ways of presenting it, never cracked the code. But thinking about it, I think part of it was it's just intimidating. There are a lot of structures. In A&P, you have to know the histology, and all of those structures have different appearance under the microscope. Most of the structures, probably all of them, have different regions, different parts with different functions, and perhaps worst of all, the vast array of enzymes that go into breaking down our food into small enough particles for our bloodstream to absorb. So it was just a lot, and it wasn't really organized very well. Your book does a pretty good job of having things in a cohesive, well organized fashion. So I thought what we'd do is just start at the top and talk a little bit about this wonderful disassembly line, if you will, that allows us to take our cheeseburger or pizza into our bodies and turn it into energy that we can use and raw materials to keep our bodies functioning. We'll barely scratch the surface. I can't possibly go over every word that's in the chapter. I would encourage you to look at the tables because they do have a lot of terms that you will frequently hear used in healthcare, and they have good pronunciations and good intelligible definitions that you can hang your hat on. So let's start at the top. When we eat, we take food into our mouths. I know that we have some aspiring dental hygienists in our group, and you will be learning a lot more about the names of the different teeth and their structure, both externally and internally, and what each type of tooth is for. One thing we sometimes forget is that our tongues play a big part in breaking food particles down from giant Big Mac sized particles into something that we can safely swallow. When you're turning the food with your tongue against your hard palate, that does probably as much, if not more, than your teeth typically do for breaking it down. Also in the mouth, we have three sets of salivary glands. The biggest ones are called the parotid glands. They're here at the angle of your jaw. And if you think about it, you can probably feel it right now. Pretend that I just gave you a really sour grape, and you can almost feel them jumping into action. You've certainly bitten into something sour and felt that instant painful release as the parotid glands release the saliva into your mouth. We also have submandibular glands, and as you would expect from their names, they're right here underneath the mandible. And I'll spare you the demo on this one. We have sublingual glands. Lingual means your tongue. So there are a series of smaller salivary glands underneath your tongue. The job of the salivary glands is primarily to moisten your food. Interestingly, it's saliva that allows you to taste your food because you can't really taste, much less smell, your food until those chemicals are put into an aqueous or watery solution. The saliva also helps to protect your mouth and your teeth, and it begins the very earliest part of digestion. It's not a big part, but saliva contains amylase, A-M-Y-L-A-S-E. And when you hear ASE on the end of a chemical's name, that gives you a huge hint that you're talking about an enzyme. Enzymes are protein structures that help to, in this case, catalyze or hurry up a reaction of another chemical without being changed themselves. So amylase helps to break down starch, like in potatoes, potato chips, bread, a cracker, into smaller chains of sugars. You can check this out yourself. Kids think it's fun. Take a soda cracker, which is not sweet, a regular saltine cracker, put it in your mouth and chew, but don't swallow. And in a few moments really, you'll begin to feel that the cracker turns into something sweet. The amylase in your saliva is beginning to break apart the starch molecule into smaller sugar molecules. The next thing that needs to happen is for the moistened glop or chunk of food, which is now called a bolus, B-O-L-U-S, needs to move back into your pharynx, your throat, to be swallowed. Now, you'll remember from our respiratory discussion, it's really important that the food not go into your trachea. And that's why we have that handy little epiglottis, the guardian of the airway, the trap door, that when you swallow, closes your trachea so the pizza does not end up in your lungs. That would be a disaster. Instead, it is directed posteriorly to your esophagus, the muscular tube that leads from your mouth or throat down into your stomach. The esophagus moves food along by that action we learned about in the chapter on muscles called peristalsis, that squeezing boa constrictor-like movement of smooth muscle. So once you swallow something, and that process is called deglutition, once you have done the deglutition process, that's the last point at which you have any control over what's happening throughout the alimentary canal, the tube that goes through your body from one end to the other. I should have mentioned the formal name for chewing that we talked about was mastication. So after mastication comes deglutition or swallowing. And then peristalsis, that action of the esophagus, smooth muscle, propels the food on down into your stomach. That's why if you really wanted to, you could stand on your head and still eat an ice cream sandwich and it would work. Might not be comfortable, but it would work. Now, at the bottom of the esophagus, it plunges through the diaphragm. Remember the diaphragm from the discussion of breathing, that big muscle with the tricky G in its spelling? There's a hole in the diaphragm for the esophagus to pierce as it goes into the stomach. The diaphragm should snug up pretty tightly around the esophagus as it plunges through. And that's called, get ready, the gastroesophageal sphincter. A sphincter is a muscle that squeezes like a stopper. So the gastroesophageal junction, the sphincter there, is actually the diaphragm pushing in. Now we know that sometimes it doesn't do a very good job. And when that happens, acid from the stomach can splash back up into the distal or bottom part of the esophagus and cause heartburn or esophagitis. There are conditions that can make that worse, quite a few. Pregnant women often experience esophagitis or heartburn because the extra volume within the abdomen pushes up on the stomach, making reflux of acid into the esophagus more common. Drinking alcohol can lead to heartburn because it causes that sphincter not to snug up as tightly as it should. Same thing can happen with caffeine, chocolate, a variety of things. And many people experience that with capsaicins. The hotness of hot peppers will cause the same problem. Now, if the opening becomes abnormally large in the diaphragm, instead of being able to snug down tight, it's kind of big and floppy, droopy, and may even allow part of the stomach to slide back up into the chest. That's what a hiatal hernia is. And if the stomach slides up there, that's a sliding hiatal hernia. Sometimes has to be repaired surgically. So finally, we've made it down into the stomach. Students I found tend to overestimate the importance of the stomach for digestion. There is some chemical breakdown of the food there. Two main chemicals cause that. For one, your stomach is a vat of hydrochloric acid, pH 1, really strong stuff down there. So you wonder, why doesn't that acid digest the stomach itself and the surrounding organs? Well, the answer is the stomach has a very tight lining of mucus-producing cells that produce a protective layer of mucus that doesn't allow, in normal circumstances, any of the acid to damage the stomach or the surrounding organs. But sometimes that system fails and we end up with gastric ulcers. Let's see, the other chemical that we find there is pepsin, and that is an enzyme that starts to break down protein. The hydrochloric acid does something called denaturation. If you know a little bit about biochemistry, you know that proteins are tightly wound structures that would be hard for the pepsin and later enzymes to break apart. It's because we can't absorb a big chunk of protein. So the hydrochloric acid starts to relax or unwind, or the word we use is denature the proteins. And the pepsin begins the process of chopping up those proteins into smaller chains of the amino acids that compose them. But the main digestive purpose of your stomach is to sort of finish the job that your teeth and your palate started. Your stomach has 3 layers of smooth muscle that allow it not only to squeeze, but to wring and twist. It can really dance down there. And as it does that, the food that you've swallowed as a bolus gets sloshed back and forth and mixed with the chemicals we just talked about until by the time it leaves the stomach, it's a smooth paste that we call chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. You hear people sometimes mispronounce it as chime, like a doorbell, but it's chyme. The CH is pronounced like a K. This chyme leaves the stomach through the distal end, the outgoing end of the stomach, which is the pylorus, and the tight muscle ring down there that keeps the stomach closed until that churning action is complete is called the pyloric sphincter. If you're interested in little people, as I was, you know that sometimes babies are born with that sphincter too tight, and that's called pyloric stenosis. It's not too uncommon thing. Kids who have that, when they throw up, they are like super soakers. They could hit that wall behind me. I've seen it happen. So that's something that has to be typically corrected surgically, now usually done through endoscopy. But that has to be fixed pretty quickly, or the child literally can't get food from their stomach down into the small intestine. Now we've made it to the small intestine. There are 3 parts of the small intestine. First, the C-shaped duodenum. That's one of our words from the Arabic. It literally means 12 fingers. So I guess the early Arabic anatomist actually measured about how big the duodenum was, and it was about 12 fingers worth. So the duodenum is the first part. More on that in a minute. The next part is the jejunum, and the third part is the ileum. And remember, this is the ileum, I-L-E-U-M, not to be confused with the I-L-I-U-M that's part of your hip bone. All right, so what happens in those 3 parts? This is where the majority of the digestion of your food takes place. It's vital. The duodenum isn't very long, but it's where 2 important ducts or passageways or tubes enter that allow the digestion of your food to take place. So let's talk a bit about those. Most of the enzymes that digest your food are not made in the alimentary canal, in the tube itself. They are outsourced, if you will, to the pancreas. The pancreas is really 2 glands in one. Today we'll talk about the exocrine part. An exocrine gland is a gland that has a duct that opens onto a body surface or another body cavity. In this case, there's a duct or tube that empties into the small intestine. And what that duct carries is the enzymes that the pancreatic cells make that allow us to break down the big food molecules into smaller ones that can be absorbed further on in the small intestine. So what would these include? There's a boatload of them. You don't need to remember them all. One group goes by the name protease, and it's exactly what you'd think. It's a collection of enzymes, primarily trypsin, and, well, there's several. You don't need to know at this point. Pepsin, trypsin, several, that can break a big, long chain of amino acids comprising a protein into smaller ones. Each of these breaks a particular part. Carboxypeptidase, that's a tongue twister, for instance, breaks off the end of an amino acid. You don't need to learn that from me. But to be able to digest and later on absorb protein, you have to have the proteases, a group of protein digesting enzymes from the pancreas. We also have some that can digest carbohydrate, primarily amylase. Amylase can break starch, which is really a chain of sugar molecules, into individual sugar molecules. So it's really important. And finally, we have lipases, again, a generic name for a group of enzymes, but lipase breaks down fat molecules. So our three big macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats or lipids, are the enzymes that allow us to break those down so they can be absorbed later. They all come from the pancreas. The other big important duct that empties in to the duodenum comes from the liver. And the liver and its little companion organ on the underside, the gallbladder. The liver makes bile. We got to digress just a little bit here. You may remember when we talked about blood, you may have read that the red blood cells contain that magical hemoglobin that can carry oxygen. In fact, that's about all that's inside a red blood cell, not a lot else in there. Red blood cells, as they whiz through the circulatory system, all those thousands of miles of blood vessels, they take a real beating. And because they don't have a nucleus, they can't divide. So they only live a maximum of about 120 days. And when they're shot, they're shot. So what happens then? Well, most of them end up in your spleen where they begin to be broken down. Now, long before recycling became eco-fashionable, your body had figured out how to do it. Because a lot of things the body needs for most of human history were not in reliable supply. So, when we get a hemoglobin molecule from the red blood cell, your body can recycle the protein chains, the 4 chains that make up the hemoglobin molecule. It can break those down and turn it into another kind of protein. Very nice. It can also take that precious little iron molecule that is sort of the car seat for the oxygen, if you will. It really wants to hang on to that, and it stores it several places, in your bone marrow, in your spleen, little in your liver, but it does not want to let iron go because, again, for a lot of human history, there wasn't a lot of iron around. The problem is, like a K-cup, there's a part that you can't recycle, and that is the heme ring. So what is your body going to do with that? You know, we can't use it to build something else. That heme molecule ends up in your liver, and your liver uses it to make bile. Finally, a word that's easy to say and easy to spell. So the bile in your liver is made up of recycled heme. It's yellow at that point, and that's why people who have livers that aren't functioning well turn yellow. They become icteric, is a word for your skin turning yellow. The more commonly known word is jaundice. So people who have liver disease, where their liver can't get rid of the bile and it backs up into other tissues, that's what we call icterus. We say they are icteric. Their sclera, the white of the eyes, typically becomes icteric. And we say that they have jaundice. And there are a lot of reasons that can happen beyond our scope right now. But at any rate, what is that bile any good for? Well, it doesn't digest anything, but when it's delivered to the small intestine, the fat that we eat tends to hang out in big globs of fat, big bubbles of fat. If you've ever made homemade salad dressing like a vinaigrette dressing, or if you've poured off broth like you're going to make gravy, you can tell I cook, you know that the fat tends to separate from the water-based fluid. So if you take vinegar, which is water-based, shake it up with some olive oil and leave it on the counter, in a little while when you come back, the olive oil is at the top because fat molecules want to stick together, separate from water. Our digestive juices are watery, and without the help of bile, all that fat tends to just glob up, and those lipases can't really get in there to digest it and break it down to something our body can use. So what bile does is turn big fat globules into itty bitty bitty bubbles, and that's called emulsification. It's an emulsifier. So for those of you who cook, you may know that if you stir in a little mayonnaise, just even a teaspoon into your vinaigrette dressing, it doesn't separate anymore because it's been emulsified. Ice cream, lots of dairy products, commercial salad dressings. If you look on the back, you'll see lecithin and other emulsifiers because emulsifiers will keep a watery and a fat solution from separating. And that's the digestive purpose of bile. It's how our body figures out a way to reuse something that otherwise couldn't be recycled. All right, so now we're down in the small intestine. We're breaking down big food molecules into smaller ones. Bile is helping us break big fat bubbles down into small ones where the lipases can digest it into even smaller molecules that we can use. As the digestive juices and the products of digestion move on down, the ileum, the last part of the small intestine, does a couple of important things. It absorbs some nutrients. It also absorbs quite a bit of water, and it delivers the nutrients that have now been broken down by the portal vein up to the liver. Liver has a lot of important jobs, and part of that is to process and package the digested food so that it can be delivered maybe to your leg for a quadriceps muscle, or it may deliver some, I don't know, something to make hair. It may make antibodies so you don't get COVID. It can do a lot of different things. It makes proteins that help your blood to clot so you don't bleed to death. So the liver is a super busy place, both making bile and taking the products of digestion and changing them into something that your body can use either for function or to keep the structure built. Whew. Now, finally, we're to the end of the small intestine, and we reach another valve or sphincter, and it's called the ileocecal valve. Ileo for ileum, and cecal for the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine. We tend to say colon and large intestine, even in healthcare, interchangeably, but that's not exactly right if we want to be proper about it. The first part of the large intestine is the pouch-like cecum, where the ileum releases what's left after we've taken most of what we can get out of the food. So we've got some watery stuff. We have fiber, which your grandma would have called roughage, that we can't digest. More on that in a minute. And so that's now moving into the colon. The colon's not necessary for survival. It's more or less a convenience organ. Its primary role is to reclaim the water that's left in the after digestion in the small intestine. So big on absorbing water, although most of it has been reabsorbed by the time it leaves the ileum. But if you don't want to have diarrhea all the time, it's really nice to have a colon. So the cecum is the first part, and that's where that little troublemaker, the vermiform appendix, we usually shorten it to just appendix, that's where it's located. A lot of speculation about why we have one beyond our scope today. Take A&P, we'll talk about it. But the appendix is in your right lower quadrant where your cecum is. Then the first part after the cecum is the ascending or right-sided colon. It goes right up the right side. Then the transverse goes across up near your diaphragm from the right side to the left, and the descending colon goes down the left side. The end of the colon has a little S-curve like the Greek letter sigma, and it's called the sigmoid colon. So to recap, the parts of the large intestine: the cecum, the ascending or right colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. At the end of the sigmoid colon, we are to the rectum, another thing that it's nice to have, where once you're potty trained, fecal material can be stored until you can find an appropriate place to leave it, like a bathroom. And then at the very end of the alimentary canal, we have the anus, the passage to the outside where fecal material leaves from. You probably knew that part. Now, I mentioned that one of the main purposes of a colon is to reabsorb water so that feces, that's the word for poop, is either solid or semi-solid. But it has another important purpose. We, unlike cows and deer and other grazing animals, cannot digest cellulose. Cellulose, if you've had some biology, is the material that makes up the walls of the plants we eat. So think of corn, which is in season right now. We have corn kernels. The walls of those corn kernels are made up of cellulose. Think about the strings in celery. You get the drift, what your grandma called roughage. Well, we have a lot of friendly bacteria that live in our colon, and their job is to break that down. In the process, they produce for us vitamin K, which is critical for blood clotting. So that's a handy reason to have a colon as well, not just for fluid absorption, but for vitamin K production. In the process, these bacteria, they do a sort of fermentation act and they produce gas. The proper word for intestinal gas is flatus, and if someone has a lot of it, we say they are flatulent. So you probably knew that word already too. We make a lot of jokes about that, but in healthcare, particularly if someone's had abdominal surgery, we ask them, have you passed any gas? And we're glad to hear if they are willing to admit that they have, because sometimes patients' GI tract just shuts down, just goes offline when surgeons have been in there mucking about. So we know that the patient's digestive tract is starting to heal, to go back online, if you will, and that we can give them something other than clear liquid once they start. Very often, one of the first signs that things are getting back to normal is that they start producing and passing some gas. You'll be asking people about that, many of you in your careers. Let's see. The proper word for pooping is defecation. You may know that one. I'm going to take a quick scan through and see if I see any words that I'm thinking, probably we should have talked about that. I really think we've hit most of them, and that's probably more than what you really wanted to know. Some interesting words about the mouth. Some stuff about the stomach and its parts. Some small intestine. Crohn's disease, and you hear commercials on TV for drugs that are helpful to those patients pretty often these days. That is an inflammatory disease, an inflammatory bowel disease. Crohn's disease, or your book says Crohn, I learned Crohn's with an apostrophe S, but it affects primarily the small intestine and sometimes the large intestine as well. Ulcerative colitis is very much like Crohn's disease, but it is confined to the large intestine. Hepatitis, that's something I didn't mention at the very beginning. We'll try to finish up with this. The specialists who deal with various parts of the digestive tract have specialized names, of course. So a person who is trained in internal medicine and deals with digestive diseases in general is called a gastroenterologist. Sometimes these people subspecialize. For instance, if they specialize in diseases of the liver, they're called a hepatologist. So if you had hepatitis or some other liver disease like cirrhosis, you might see a hepatologist who's a specialized gastroenterologist who's a specialized internist or internal medicine physician. We also have surgical specialists like colorectal surgeons who deal primarily with diseases of the digestive tract. General surgeons perform the more common operations like appendectomies, cholecystectomy, which is removing the gallbladder. Let's see, trying to think if there was another specialist. It just went through my mind. It's gone. That's probably more than you wanted to know, as again, your book has a lot of wonderful information, and it is generally pretty well capsulized in there are quite a few tables in this rather lengthy chapter. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to give me an email and I'll try to answer. Also, be sure to have a good look at your review questions, because once again, your quiz questions will come primarily from your review questions. Thanks for listening in, and I hope you've enjoyed our trip through the digestive tract.